Welcome back to Storyteller, and I have another cousin story, which are some of my best. So, this particular story has to do with Uncle Roy's snowmobile. And as soon as I say Uncle Roy's snowmobile, I know that my cousins go, ah, yes. So, Uncle Roy, this was a cousin of my dad's, and he, he had a snowmobile. Now, this was back in the 70s, right? I wasn't even a teenager yet. And we, he had a snowmobile and he left it down at the shop. I wish I could tell stories about the shop. Maybe I should do a short on the shop, because the shop is where Uncle Clayton and Uncle Chuck, like, they had their business, their construction business, but it was also the place where us kids seemed to always gravitate to, because we needed Uncle Clayton to fix something, or we needed a tool like a shovel to dig a trail in the woods or something. So Uncle Roy kept his snowmobile at the shop. He didn't keep it at home down in Berrien Springs because he didn't have room and there wasn't a place to ride it. We had places to ride it. So Uncle had originally bought 40 acres off of Shawnee Road, went all the way down to University Airport property, and we had all that to ride. Now, we also had a neighbor to the south, Perry Nelson, wonderful guy. He was in my mom's class, I believe, in high school. So he was a classmate of hers. He had apple orchards. And then we had Rudy, who lived to the, actually, Perry lived to the east, Rudy lived to the west. And we would kind of ride in his stuff sometimes, not very often, because it was always cornfields, and cornfields are nasty to ride in with a snowmobile, especially if there's not too much snow. It's kind of like that. But Perry, not only did he have orchards, but he had an alfalfa field, and that alfalfa field was probably at least 20 acres. And then behind Uncle Clayton's house, downhill, it was downhill probably, let's say that 15 acres of Uncle's 40 acres took up my dad's house, which he bought like 5 acres, Uncle Chuck's house, Uncle Clayton's house, and the shop. That maybe was 15 acres. And then there was another 15 acres of apple trees. And then there was probably another, another 10, maybe 10, 15 acres of garden. It was low ground, it was fertile. There was a pond that Uncle dug. I actually remember digging that pond, helping dig that pond. Uncle rented an excavator and a couple dump trucks, and my dad was driving one of the dump trucks. We were hauling dirt up by Uncle's house to have a garden way up on the hill, and so my dad actually had let me steer this giant dump truck. I mean, it was huge. Anyway, maybe that's a different story. But anyway, we had acres and acres to ride a snowmobile. I mean, and of course I mentioned that Uncle's property bordered the Andrews University Air Park, where they did flight instruction. So they had runway. They had a paved runway and they had a grass runway. And so a couple things about riding this snowmobile. Now here's how we would ride. My cousin Chuck, who was 2 years older than myself and my cousin Larry and Chuck being brothers, it would be Chuck was driving, Larry was in the middle, probably hanging on to Chuck, and then I was in the back, and there were two handles down low on the snowmobile that I would hang on to. And we would ride the snowmobile, man. We'd fill this thing up with gas and we would ride. Now, back in 1975, that's probably a little later, 1978, nobody had helmets. So the fact that I'm here isn't licensed to do things like that without a helmet, but it's proof that you can actually survive without a helmet. Because what we would do with this snowmobile, we would take it into Perry Nelson's apple orchard. And his orchard used to, it's not anymore, because he's cut out a bunch of dirt. He sold dirt as fill. I think he probably made some good money on that. And he cut down all his orchard. But back then it was hilly. All right. And we would go down his orchard, which would be east. We'd get way down that orchard and we would turn around. And Cousin Chuck seemed to have 2 speeds. Chuck was a 2-speed driver. Full throttle or on the brake. 2 speeds. And Chuck would turn around down there in the orchard. And remember, these trees are probably 20, 25 feet apart. These were big apple trees. They were not dwarfs, big apple trees. And he would open up that snowmobile, man, just full throttle. And a lot of that orchard was flat. And then it actually, as we got close to where Chuck and Larry lived, it went up. And then it went kind of flat. And then it went down. And then it kind of went up. And then there was their property. And so we would just be hauling the mail through these apple orchards. Like, I mean, when I first saw Star Wars and Luke, attacking the Death Star and flying the trench, I'm like, that's just like riding Uncle Roy's snowmobile through Perry's orchard. No problem. 60 miles an hour, not a problem. Easy. And we would come flying up that hill and launch. Remember? This is another story about being airborne. Because airborne is the coolest thing that you can ever do. And we would launch the snowmobile. I don't know how high we flew. I don't know how far we flew. But we would go flying. And remember, it's kind of a tabletop. So we would fly. We would land past halfway on this tabletop. Wham! And of course, if we had enough snow, it wasn't that bad of a landing. We would land. Then we would hit the other end of the table, go off the end, and Chuck's on the brakes, man. Just because now we're braking downhill to the end of the orchard. We come grinding to a halt. Oh man, I can just remember that feeling. Airborne. And the trees, going up. And so you're kind of looking at the tops of the trees. It's great. And of course, the other thing we would do is we would take the snowmobile out into the alfalfa field, Perry's alfalfa field. And remember, it's 20 acres, man. I don't know how many hundreds of yards this thing was. And again, Chuck would go to high gear, from braking gear to high gear. And it was just fast as that snowmobile would go. And that was rolling, right? So you get this weightless, weightless. Not really jumping the alfalfa, but just that weightless feeling. And then we get all the way to the end on the brakes, right before the woods at the end of the brakes, at the end of the field. And then we'd go down by the airstrip, and we'd pause, and we'd look. We actually would look for airplanes before going out onto the airstrip. Now, we wouldn't go out on the paved strip because they would plow that, of course. But right beside there was grass on both sides. Now, you had to watch out for the row of lights because they had lights, so don't run over the lights, all right? We weren't into destruction. But we would look both ways, and then Chuck would look back. We're sitting there, snowmobile's running. He'd look back and say, watch for the Jeep. I'm like, okay, hit it. And Chuck would hit it, right? High gear. And now we have like a half a mile of runway. Shut. And I remember leaning up over Larry's shoulder, looking. I had to see that speedometer just creeping up, and I know that speedo hit 70 every single time. 3 kids, all under teenage level, doing 70 miles an hour with no helmets on a private airstrip. You could imagine how fun that was. Now, my job, watch for the Jeep, which my cousin would tell me, I'd be looking, because I was sitting in the back, I'd be looking over my shoulder, I'd be looking for the little red Jeep. I found out later, of course, that it was Uncle Harry Lloyd who got pretty close to years later. He actually was one of my instructors when I took pilot training at that airport. I was watching for the Jeep because if the Jeep was coming out, it meant they were coming to get us and drive us off the property. So we would go up and down that strip. Usually we could get a couple runs up and down that strip. I'd be like, the Jeep, Chuck, the Jeep. And he'd swerve and we'd go zipping up into Uncle's property and off the airport. So that was totally cool. And then one other time, if you go past the airport, you get down to what we called the swamp. And the swamp was off the east end of the Andrews property. It might have still been their property, I don't know, but it was between that Andrews airport property and the county youth fair, which, by the way, if you go down through the swamp, you could hop the fence and get into the county youth fair without paying an entrance fee, just in case anybody needs to know that. But in the winter, we could go down on the swamp and ride the snowmobile. So Chuck and I went down there one time. I don't remember doing this too often, but Chuck and I went down there one time. And the cool thing about the swamp, you get a layer of snow, but there's ice underneath. And so the snowmobile it was like power sliding. And again, Chuck, 2 speeds, full braking or full throttle. So we're full throttle on the swamp, and now it's clear, you know, there's nothing to hinder you. And he'd be like, lean, and he'd be full throttle, thumb trigger wide open, and we'd both be leaning off this snowmobile, just power. And I do mean power. I don't mean brake and slide. I mean power slide. Just on the ice, just sliding, making these huge turns. It was a blast. And so Chuck and I were doing this wide open, baby. I mean wide open. Doing that, leaning down, and all of a sudden, ka-choom, the snowmobile flipped. Like we're sliding, and it caught. And it just went chunk, and we were just like, woo, whoa. There were no angels singing, man. There was like, uh-oh, and we flew. Just launched. I mean, even though we were leaning, we went flying the other way because that's how the snowmobile turned. Thankfully, right, there's 5 to 6 inches of snow on the swamp, so when you land, you basically aren't landing on ice, you're landing on snow. So we hit and slide for 30 feet and come to a halt. Now, obviously, we had elbows that were kind of hurting and knees, you know, maybe his shoulder. No broken bones. And of course, the snowmobile, you know, would go to idle, and it kind of rolled, and I don't know how it ended up. It ended up on its side. So Chuck ran over and shut it off, and we walked back. We're like, what the heck did we hit? There was nothing out here. So we walked back, and we found out what happened was the ice, you know, on a swamp where you have the snow and stuff, it'll freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw. And so what happened is the skis on the snowmobile actually have a metal rod as a runner right down the middle. And as we were sliding, there was different layers of ice that had little air gaps in it, probably from the snow freezing and thawing. And as we were sliding in this one particular area, it broke through that layer. And so it just caught that little rod and just flipped the snowmobile. So we survived. The snowmobile was okay. You know, I do think that snowmobile had a couple of Uncle Clayton's welding expertise on the block of the engine. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if we were responsible for any of that. I don't know if Roy, by the way, Roy and cousin Chuck, very much related. I think Uncle Roy drove that snowmobile a lot like cousin Chuck did. I'm just saying. So I don't think it was us. I don't remember wrecking the snowmobile and seeing oil running out all over. But anyway, we had a lot of fun on that snowmobile. So next time you go snowmobiling somewhere, just remember, I've been there and I know how fun it is. I would suggest that you wear a helmet.